Good morning, Wabash. Today, speaking in Pioneer Chapel is Dr. Andrew Klein with his talk titled Chivalry Isn't Dead. It's a zombified corpse of a Frankenstein's creation kind of idea that never really breathed its first. Dr. Klein is a visiting assistant professor of English here at Wabash. He hails from the frosty Saskatchewan plains of Canada, where he attended the University of Saskatchewan and received his master's in interdisciplinary studies. In 2016, he received his doctorate from the University of Notre Dame, where he studied as a fellow of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. He specializes in medieval English, Scottish, and Norse literature, and at Wabash teaches courses in medieval and early modern British literature, fantasy, and digital humanities. He's a father of 4, which means when he isn't sitting in his office reading, he is at home sitting on his children reading. Please welcome Dr. Andrew Klein.
Good morning, Wabash. As a medievalist, there are a few things I think about more than most people. My Google search history can give you a nice sampling of this. A week ago, I was looking up flying buttresses. Yes, it's fun to say, it's even more fun to think about. Or, how much beer did medieval monks drink? The answer to that question is that they drank a hell of a lot more than you, which is saying a lot at an all-male college. Or how about, how do you build a catapult? Where can I launch my catapult? Or chainmail lingerie? I was just curious. Or, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen European swallow? Any Python fans out there? This is just a selection of the kinds of things that I feel called upon by my vocation to think about. I also reflect frequently on the ways particular words or ideas inherited from the Middle Ages have changed through the many centuries since. For instance, most of our words for a nasty smell, reek, stink, odor, what have you, these words weren't always negative ones. But through some odd linguistic olfactory connection, we're unable to keep words for smell from becoming negative. Imagine how much harder it would have been to insult one another during your pimpled teenage years without the simple concept of BO. Bro, you smell. Why, thank you. Along the same lines, I also think about chivalry more than the average person. At least until coming to Wabash, I thought I did. But at Wabash, for some of us, chivalry is a uniquely intimate part of our identity. All of you have been called upon, after all, to act as gentlemen. And when you first got here, you were pressed to discover amongst yourselves what this word means. Definitions, I'm told, often hinge on ideas like being respectful, behaving ethically or morally, and, of course, being chivalrous. In fact, Wabash has been imagined for some time as the last bastion of chivalry in this fallen world. At the end of the 19th century, geologist John Collette described the college's founding in this way. Like knights of chivalry or standard bearers of a forlorn hope, they laid their plans, they staked off their grounds, and kneeling on the snow that frosty November morning, consecrated themselves to the enterprise and it to God in heaven. It's a beautiful image, made finer by the strains of romanticism you can see in it. The founding of Wabash, reimagined as the sanctuary of chivalry's waning light. And any number of definitions of gentleman contains references to chivalry. Peggy Noonan's recent Wall Street Journal piece, America Needs More Gentlemen, supplies a number of them. A gentleman is, quote, chivalrous, courteous, honorable. Or a gentleman, quote, holds chivalry and politeness in great regard. Well, this sounds great, but like gentlemen, chivalry could do with a little bit of definition, right? What is chivalry? We act like it's a given, especially around here, like we know what chivalry means instantly, as though our moms and dads sat us down for the talk with the same Book of Chivalry for Dummies and showed us how it works. But like most ideas that are hundreds and hundreds of years old, it's a little bit complicated. When I sat down to write this talk, I kept asking myself to define it. What is chivalry? What is chivalry? I mean, I should know. I use the word in class all the time. In fact, I make it one of my specialties to be able to speak with some authority on the subject. So, naturally, I turned to Google to find out what the real experts had to say. It didn't take long once you start down the path to discover that most regular people who decide to write about chivalry at any length are interested in one thing. Is chivalry dead or isn't it? The sheer amount of articles with "Chivalry is Dead" in the title or some variation of that is actually pretty daunting. So as the debate over chivalry's vital signs rages on, I realized, having read Frankenstein but very recently with my EQ students, that hey, chivalry isn't dead. It's the zombified corpse of a Frankenstein's creature kind of idea that never really breathed its first. That should clear things up, right? Well, you gotta give me a little bit of time to explain. First up, chivalry never really existed. Sorry, guys. What? Yes, indeed, my friend, chivalry, at least as a code of conduct, only appeared after the Middle Ages, retroactively. As such, by its very nature, when we talk about chivalry, we are always gesturing to some prior time, to some prior idea that never actually existed. This is what I mean when I say that the idea of chivalry never really breathed its first. We can understand really easily where the word chivalry comes from. The French word for knight, chevalier, from the word for horse, cheval, gives us chivalry. This word, in its inception, signified the aristocratic mounted warrior of the High Middle Ages. Chevaliers were military men, and once the Crusades got into full swing, their devotion to the craft of knights was matched only by their presumed devotion to Christianity. The problem is that the word chivalry, or chevalier, never stood for any single unifying concept or code of conduct across sources or across European cultures that would account for a chivalric ideology at this early date in Europe. It would be like saying that athleticism implied a code of conduct. Chivalry, more than anything, meant you were really good at bashing in heads from sitting on top of a horse. The ideology of chivalry would have to wait hundreds of years until about the middle of the 18th century, the period of Romanticism, which resurrected what its proponents thought of as an old code of conduct. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Bear with me. So this warrior figure, the chevalier, then, provides the body of our chivalric creature. To this body of an aristocratic, religiously devout warrior class was sutured, at a later date, the notion of courtesy, or sophisticated courtly refinement. We're talking humility, polished manners of the "is this a salad fork or not" kind of variety. Fashionableness, being up on the latest tale, and dancing, playing chess, singing songs. This was courtesy, as it was the style of the upper classes. Chevaliers, who were nobles, of course, also became courtly in their manners, and our chivalric creation has now grown a little bit. But more important than these for our modern notions of chivalry was the idea of courtly love that became hip a little bit later for these guys. The core idea behind courtly love is that noble knights can perform truly great feats only if they are inspired by a truly great woman. The cult of courtly love demanded the elevation of woman as an almost divine figure that could make true lovers more noble still. Before it got attached to knights, courtly love found expression in Europe initially in the poets of France. I'll read an excerpt from the granddaddy of all French troubadours, Bernard de Ventadorn. He's a 12th century writer. In one of his earliest poems, he says, "When I see the lark beat his wings for joy against the sun's rays, until he forgets to fly and plummets down for the sheer delight which goes to his heart, alas, great envy comes to me of those whom I see filled with happiness, and I marvel that my heart does not instantly melt from desire. Alas, I thought I knew so much about love, and really I know so little, for I cannot keep myself from loving her, for whom I shall have no favor. She was stolen from me. She has stolen from me my heart, myself, herself, and all the world. When she took herself from me, she left me nothing but desire and a longing heart. Never have I been in control of myself, or even belonged to myself from the hour that she let me gaze into her eyes, the mirror that pleases me so greatly. Mirror, since I saw myself reflected in you, deep sighs have been killing me. I have lost myself just as handsome Narcissus lost himself in the fountain." You can see here the pining of the lover for his beloved, right? She remains unattainable, aloof, and he longs for her, painfully. Naturally, we kind of root for this guy. All of us have met this character at a very early age. He's the subject of hundreds of romantic comedies, Disney movies, sitcoms, and we will naturally, for the moment, ignore Bernard's insistence that his beloved has wronged him in some way, and the sort of strains of narcissism that come along with this, right? This style of courtly love was mixed in with the tales of chevaliers to give us our most well-known sources of modern chivalry. This is where we get a lot of it from. King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. These French stories would be retold most famously in the 15th century by the Englishman Sir Thomas Malory, who gives us most of what we today associate with King Arthur. So with the addition of that sort of grafted flesh of courtly love, courtly manners, and medieval romance to the aristocratic warrior culture of chevaliers, we get a body of characteristics that provide us with a basis for what would later become chivalry. However, this burgeoning ideology, by the time Malory is writing about it, is already withering on the vine. An ideal that only ever existed in the imagination, the disparity between reality and the romance tales was only too obvious to readers of the 16th and 17th centuries. They would soon be satirizing it. And with the most infamous, though loving, takedown of chivalry in its history, Don Quixote, those early ideas seemed to die. But the romanticism of the 18th and 19th centuries would revive this sutured corpse, electrifying it with some of the best writing to come out of 19th century Britain. Walter Scott, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, and yes, Mary Shelley, all of these took comfort in looking at an idealized version of the past, at what they perceived were simpler, more moral times. This was the beginning of what we call medievalism, the use of and devotion of medieval things. Early in this period, we find Walter Scott discussing chivalry as an established code of conduct during the Middle Ages. He says, quote, "Amid the various duties of knighthood, that of protecting the female sex, respecting their persons, and redressing their wrongs, becoming the champion of their cause, and the chastiser of those by whom they were injured, was represented as one of the principal objects of the institution." The various conflations that Scott pulls off here are impressive. We've already established that there was no institution of chivalry in the Middle Ages. But under this heading, Scott seems to have wholeheartedly taken the principles governing Arthurian fantasies as the realities of the Middle Ages. But other than that, this language of protecting, respecting, redressing, and championing, this all sounds pretty great, right? Well, by way of an answer to that, I want to tell you a brief story about myself as a kid. Very short. One summer, when I was about 6 years old, I became obsessed with taking care of the local earthworm population in my neighborhood. This was before I would eat them as a cool trick for my friends. Every time there was rain, I would step outside and survey our cul-de-sac, aghast at what I interpreted to be some kind of war zone. Bodies of worms strewn about the sidewalks and driveways as though a bomb had launched them from their cozy homes. I was clever, observant, so I noted that worms seemed to gather in a few of the potholes out in the street when they were filled with water. I presumed that many worms, writhing upon the ground, were just trying vainly to reach their friends in some of those choice puddles. I began dutifully to collect handful upon handful of worms, lots and lots of them, and I would bring them to one big puddle, which seemed like a really nice place to keep them all. I did this throughout the summer, proud when my mounds of worms were large enough to actually peek out of the top of a deep puddle. At one point, coming in from outside, washing my hands, I bragged to my dad about how wonderful I was to these worms. I was their goddamn savior. Dad laughed, and he told me that I was probably just drowning them all. I was stunned. What's the point of this weird story about me being a weird kid? Well, when I was this weird kid, that was a brief lesson in how easily my best intentions and my belief that what I was doing was the right thing could have unexpected and really harmful consequences. Let's back up a bit to old Walter Scott and his buddies. Their ideal of chivalry. The raising up of women on the pedestal of chivalry in England, where we've gotten most of our ideas about this from, seems great, even benign on its surface. But as men began to embrace the notion of woman as pure and morally superior, all couched in terms of chivalric protection and submission and deference and duty, they began to create a new role for women as angelic and, of necessity, removed from the offending and degrading effects of the world of man. Women became what is known as the angel in the house. The mission of good chivalric men of keeping these angels pure and domestic, protecting them, also necessitated, paradoxically, new legislation and new cultural norms that stripped women further of their rights and enshrined in law the subordination of women to men, their protectors. We end up with chivalry in all of its tyranny and monstrosity, pieced together from a misremembered or misunderstood fragmentary medieval past. And these medieval fragments, I have to point out, have their seedy underbelly too. Sir Thomas Malory, the Englishman who essentially brought us Arthurian chivalry, he wrote that knights were, quote, never to murder, never to commit treason, always to be merciful, and to always help ladies, damsels, and gentlewomen to strengthen their rights and to never rape them. Anytime you need to swear not to rape someone in order to join a club, you've clearly already got a bit of a problem. So it's no surprise that in his life, Sir Thomas Malory was imprisoned for extortion, ambushing, church robbing, and at least 2 counts of rape. Thomas Malory wrote his tales of chivalry from a jail cell. Or perhaps we should go back to the source of courtly love, our troubadour Bernard de Ventadorn. I didn't finish his poem before that I started reading. Let me continue just a bit. Responding to the rejection of his beloved, he says, I despair of women. No more will I trust them. And just as I used to defend them, now I shall denounce them. Since I see that none aids me against her who destroys and confounds me, I fear and distrust them all, for I know well they are all alike. In this, my lady certainly shows herself to be a woman, and for it I reproach her, for she wants not that which she ought to want, and what is forbidden she loves. These are the roots of chivalry. Acts of worship that, when not returned with sexual favors, lead down the path of accusation and of misogyny. A friend of mine recently pointed out the similarity between the language that I just read and some more recent writings. I'll just read a bit. Everything my father taught me was a proven wrong. He raised me to be a polite, kind gentleman. In a decent world, that would be ideal. But the polite, kind gentleman doesn't win in the real world. The girls don't flock to the gentleman. I realized that I would be a virgin forever, condemned to suffer rejection and humiliation at the hands of women because they don't fancy me, because their sexual attractions are flawed. If they won't accept me among them, then they are my enemies. They showed no mercy, and in turn, I will show them no mercy. The writer of these phrases was Elliot Rodger. In 2014, shortly after sending his manifesto containing pages and pages detailing his disappointment with women to a few people, Rodger murdered 6 people and injured 14 more before shooting himself in the head during a killing spree in California. I must be clear that I'm not trying to suggest that anyone who claims to follow a chivalrous code of conduct is gearing up to be a rapist or a psychopath. It's not as simple as that, right? But the lineage of chivalry is one that has always been about entitlement. If I act like this, then I will get that. When this sense of entitled chivalry becomes the norm, as it has when we embrace it uncritically as central to our idea of being a man, it becomes toxic. And it has a large share in fostering what we now identify as rape culture. When you meet enough women who can tell the same story about how a date that began with the chivalry of ladies first ended with, you stuck-up bitch, you can't avoid the problem anymore. But you'll say, Dr. Klein, there's no way I'm expecting something in return like that. Well, no, of course you're not. Not in every interaction, but the amount of dating advice columns or articles online or in magazines or in papers that offer up ladies first, pulling out chairs, hands on the small of the back kind of chivalry as a guaranteed way to find a romantic partner suggests otherwise. We condition ourselves to expect an eventual payoff for all this good behavior. There are plenty of problems with this kind of everyday chivalry, and Dr. Trott a couple weeks ago began unpacking this at the end of her recent chapel talk, where she explained that ideology, in particular chivalry, will dangerously, often unconsciously masquerade as goodwill in order to maintain the status quo. To put a finer point on it, that brings us back to what I've been talking about here, chivalry simply maintains the angel in the house, but publicly. It casts women in the role of delicate, fragile creature that assigns men naturally the default position of benevolent protector. The unthinking exercise of modern chivalry, though frequently stemming from some laudable place of kindness and goodwill, nonetheless reaffirms the patronizing superiority of every version of patriarchy. And the much darker truth is that for many chivalrous men, though by no means all, many chivalrous men, for them chivalry comes with an expectation. By accepting chivalry unquestioned as one of our guiding lights in becoming men, we create a problem by idealizing an imagined causal relationship between one man's acts of kindness and the sexual behavior of what must be two consenting adults. So what am I suggesting? Do we need to just trash the idea of chivalry, kick it to the curb? Well, I don't know, maybe. But how do you kill a zombie? Well, I mean, you remove its head, right? But I've already shown you that the chivalry doesn't really have a head, does it? So that doesn't work so well. In any ways, I think you need to destroy the brain of a zombie to actually kill it. So, we can get into specifics. But most of us can agree that given the right circumstances, the right attention, Frankenstein's creature might not have turned into a monstrous murderer, right? Monster making can be avoided. And the answer to the chivalry problem might turn out to be pretty simple. And I'm not really original in laying it out like this, but at this point, it has to be clear that we must desex and degender chivalry if we want it to live on. For one, anytime we insist that good behavior will guarantee somebody sex, which is the tension the entire courtly love tradition is built on, we have to recognize that we're walking around with a loaded gun. And degendering chivalry shouldn't be such a big deal either. We ought to stop treating women with respect because they are women. We should be doing this because they are human, deserving of the basic dignities and support that I hope we all recognize common humanity warrants. This is not really a revolutionary concept, but it is one that flies in the face of old chivalry, and that's my point. The upshot of this is that a chivalrous person should be treating everyone with care and respect. Yes, this means different genders, creeds, races, ethnicities, it's all one. And this really does mean taking care of one another, Wabash. Because an unfortunate side effect of chivalry for men is that our egos have become so fragile that to acknowledge that sometimes we could use a door being held open for us has become incredibly difficult. So what's the use of these old stories of chivalry then? Can we bring anything from them into our present? I'd like to close with just a few thoughts on this. I'd like to talk about shame. Nowadays, we don't like to talk about shame. We live in a shame-averse culture. You do you. Who am I to judge? Talking about shame is hard. In fact, I do feel a little embarrassed just bringing it up in a chapel talk. It smacks of judginess and religiosity. But the fact of the matter at hand is that all of the greatest stories of chivalry, the medieval tales of knights, they're all stories about failure. Arthur fails to keep his kingdom together. Lancelot fails to achieve the Grail. Gawain fails to uphold his end of a fairly complicated decapitation kissing game. These stories revolve around the public revelation of private wrongdoing. That's where shame kicks in. Blood rushes to the face, tears start at the eyes, and these knights quake with shame. It's the shame of being held accountable for one's actions, and it's needed to plant the seeds of change. These knights only experience shame because they have a community that has bound themselves together with links of shared interests and values that keep them accountable. If we can take something away from these medieval fantasy figures, it's that shame can be a positive force that involves being honest with oneself, and that involves sharing as a community in an accountability for our actions. Today, we see shame being used as a weapon that divides us. We've made to feel ashamed of who we are, of our bodies, our ethnicities, our sexualities, our races, our classes, our religions, the list goes on. Paradoxically, we fail to acknowledge that we live in a time of near shamelessness. Look to the highest positions in this country, and you will see that those that should hang their tawny heads under shame's heaviest burden hold their heads high, rationalize, and lie about their wrongdoings. Sure, these people should be ashamed. Shame's real function should be to correct imbalances of power. But we should be ashamed too. It's natural and right for us to feel stung by the shame they refuse to feel. We, as politicians, should be ashamed of supporting policy in bad faith. We, as white feminists, should be ashamed of ignoring for so long the voices of black women. We, as gun enthusiasts, should be ashamed of the overreach of the NRA. We, as Christians, should be ashamed of the abuses of our church officials. And we, as male students, should be ashamed of the sexual violence perpetuated by our friends on campuses across the country. You get the picture. But I have seen real reasons to be hopeful at Wabash. I see a lot of potential in how the men of Wabash have been wielding this concept of the gentleman since coming here almost 2 years ago. The first real challenge I saw occurred more than a year ago, the shirt incident of 2016's Mona Bell game. I was impressed to see in the immediate wake of the incident the shame of students and their public expressions of sincere disappointment in The Bachelor. This is holding one another accountable. More recently, as a response to Eleanor Cliff's visit, students held a panel in this chapel that insisted we need to do more to resist complacency in the idea of the Wabash gentleman's exceptionalism. Again, keeping one another accountable for what we say and do. And even now, in the last few weeks, I've seen students holding one another accountable for the language they use and the people they hurt in the pages of The Bachelor. These are the signs of a robust redefinition of chivalry that uses shame to grow. It's a needed chivalry for the modern era. There's nowhere else in the world where these issues are being engaged with in the same way as at Wabash. You students are in a truly unique position with a unique opportunity to move the narrative of men forward. Does Wabash always fight? It's a question. Does Wabash always fight? Good. So let's quit blithely accepting what those outside of Wabash tell us gentlemen are or were, and let's show the world what gentlemen will be. Okay? Thank you.